For more than 60 years, Cuba has been one of the few countries that has consistently challenged American influence just 90 miles from the U.S. coastline. It has survived economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and decades of political pressure. Many believed Cuba had become a relic of the Cold War, a chapter of history that had finally come to an end. But today, that assumption is beginning to change. Across Washington, policymakers are once again paying close attention to the island. Not because Cuba has suddenly become a military superpower, but because it sits at the crossroads of several strategic challenges. As tensions with China and Russia continue to rise, every country in America's immediate neighborhood is being viewed through a new geopolitical lens. Cuba's deepening economic crisis, its growing dependence on foreign partners, and its strategic location in the Caribbean have turned it into an issue that extends far beyond Havana. The question is no longer whether Cuba faces serious economic and political pressure. That reality is already visible through rolling blackouts, fuel shortages, and one of the largest waves of emigration in history. The real question is whether Washington sees this moment as an opportunity to reshape its relationship with Cuba, or whether increasing pressure could create an even larger crisis. History has shown that conflicts rarely begin with military action. More often, they begin with economic pressure, diplomatic negotiations, and strategic calculations made behind closed doors. And in Cuba's case, all three are happening at the same time. So why has Cuba suddenly returned to the center of American strategic thinking? Why are analysts once again discussing the island's future after years of relative silence? And how could decisions made in Washington, Havana, Beijing, and Moscow shape the balance of power? To understand what's happening today, we first need to understand how Cuba became one of the most important geopolitical fault lines in the Americas, and why its next chapter could affect far more than just the Caribbean. To understand why Cuba has returned to Washington's strategic radar, we need to look beyond ideology and focus on geography. Cuba occupies one of the most strategically valuable locations in the Western Hemisphere. Sitting at the entrance to the Gulf of Mexico and along major shipping lanes connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Caribbean, the island lies just 90 miles from Florida. For centuries, whoever held influence over Cuba possessed a unique vantage point over maritime trade and military movement in the region. During the Cold War, that strategic reality brought the world to the brink of nuclear conflict during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. While the Soviet Union disappeared decades ago, Cuba's location never became less important. Geography doesn't change, and in geopolitics, geography often outlasts ideology. Today, however, the challenge facing Cuba is very different. Instead of military confrontation, the country is struggling through one of its worst economic crises in decades. Years of weak productivity, limited access to foreign capital, aging infrastructure, and reduced energy supplies have combined to create severe shortages of fuel, food, medicine, and electricity. Long power outages have become increasingly common. Businesses struggle to operate, and hundreds of thousands of Cubans have chosen to leave the country in search of better opportunities abroad. For Washington, these developments create both risks and opportunities. An unstable Cuba could trigger larger migration flows toward the United States, creating political pressure at home. At the same time, economic hardship also increases Havana's need for external partners, raising an important strategic question. If the United States steps back, who steps in? That question has become increasingly relevant as China expands its economic footprint across Latin America. Over the past decade, Beijing has invested heavily in infrastructure, telecommunications, and energy projects. While Cuba's economy remains relatively small, its geographic position gives it outsized strategic importance. Any expansion of Chinese influence so close to the mainland naturally attracts attention. Russia also continues to maintain political and diplomatic ties with Havana. Although Moscow's resources are far more constrained than during the Soviet era, maintaining relationships in the Caribbean remains important. It allows Russia to demonstrate that it can still project influence beyond Europe. Even limited cooperation carries symbolic value, reminding Washington that geopolitical competition is no longer confined to specific regions. This broader competition explains why U.S. policy toward Cuba cannot be viewed in isolation. It is increasingly linked to America's wider strategy of limiting the influence of rival powers. Economic sanctions, diplomatic negotiations, and regional partnerships all become tools within a much larger geopolitical contest. Yet despite the rhetoric that often surrounds U.S.-Cuba relations, direct military action remains one of the least likely outcomes. Such an operation would carry enormous political, legal, humanitarian, and diplomatic consequences. Instead, history suggests that governments usually prefer instruments that impose pressure without open conflict. Financial sanctions, export restrictions, diplomatic negotiations, and regional alliances provide governments with far greater flexibility while avoiding the unpredictability of war. Meanwhile, Cuba faces difficult choices of its own. The government must stabilize an economy under intense pressure while maintaining political control and attracting foreign investment. Reforms that encourage private enterprise could provide relief, but they also introduce political challenges for a system that has historically maintained tight state control over the economy. The outcome of this balancing act will not depend solely on decisions made in Havana. Washington's policies, China's investments, and Russia's ambitions will all influence Cuba's future. In many ways, the island has once again become a meeting point where local challenges intersect with global competition. This is why Cuba matters far beyond its size. It is a story about how major powers compete for influence, how economic crises reshape strategic calculations, and how geography continues to shape international politics. Whether the coming years bring greater cooperation, continued pressure, or heightened tension will depend on decisions being made today, often far from the streets of Havana. But one thing is already clear. After decades of relative quiet, Cuba has once again become a geopolitical story the world cannot afford to ignore. History has a habit of repeating itself. For decades, Cuba was one of the defining flashpoints of the Cold War. Today, the ideological battle has largely been replaced by something different, a competition over economics, technology, and strategic positioning. The island may no longer host Soviet missiles, but it still occupies one of the most important pieces of geopolitical real estate in the Western Hemisphere. The future of Cuba is unlikely to be decided by a single dramatic event. Instead, it will be shaped by a series of calculated decisions made in Washington, Havana, Beijing, and Moscow. Will the United States continue relying on economic pressure? Can Cuba reform its economy without changing its political system? How far are China and Russia willing to expand their presence? These questions don't just determine Cuba's future. They help define the broader balance of power across the Caribbean and Latin America. In an era of renewed great power competition, even relatively small nations can play outsized strategic roles. Geography, after all, has a way of turning local problems into global ones. For now, Cuba stands at a crossroads. One path could lead to gradual economic reform and international engagement. Another could see continued isolation and intensified rivalry. Whatever happens next, one thing is certain: Cuba is no longer just a chapter in Cold War history. It has once again become a country that strategists and military planners are watching closely. If you enjoyed this deep dive into global affairs and want more documentary-style analyses on the world's biggest geopolitical stories, make sure to subscribe to World Scope Daily. If you found this video insightful, leave a like and share your perspective in the comments. Which country do you think could become the next major geopolitical flashpoint?